And welcome to lecture number 9 of Emerging Technologies for the Circular Economy. Sorry that we had to cancel last week's lecture on short notice, but we're going to make up for it today. And we had a little bit of a buffer so that we can afford to do so. So today we are going a little bit in the direction of a case study. So thus far we talked about the relevance of sustainability, circular economy as one approach to foster sustainability or to implement more sustainable business practices. Then we spent quite a lot of time on the foundations of the Internet of Things, so going through the different parts of this big figure that we had: sensors, actuators. How does the communication among those sensors and actuators work? How do they communicate with edge or cloud devices? We also looked into processing and making sense of all the data that we collected. And today we're going to look at this in a little bit more specific use case that we in our research group are quite active in. That is a topic of sustainable and resilient food production, where we're deploying using quite a lot of the concepts from the Internet of Things. But before we get there, a little bit of news updates, or more, a little bit of a disappointing, sad part. We had the course evaluation until the end of June, and we asked you 2 or 3 times to please send us feedback, what you liked about the course and what we can do better next time. Unfortunately, we did not receive any feedback. The evaluation tool only releases the evaluation information to us if or once at least 5 people have participated. Out of the more than 70 people who are registered for this course, there were not even 5 people who were ready to provide us some feedback. And honestly, I've been a professor for 5 years now. That's the first time that happened. And yes, a little bit unfortunate, because now we do not have any information about what you liked with respect to this course, what you did not like, or what you're not liking. So we cannot really do something about this. I'm not quite sure why that happened. If there's like, if it is just not a high priority on your list, or if there was an issue with the tool, or if you just didn't know about this. Would be really interested if there was any technical blocker or anything else that went wrong, because as I said, this is the first time that this ever happened, that we did not get 5 people who give us feedback. Usually we have like 20 to 30 people in the 70-person course who provide us feedback. So yeah, we don't know what to do with this course and with the changes that we implemented this semester. If you're happy to still provide us non-anonymous feedback, we would be very glad to receive it. Use a throwaway email account if that helps, but also if you leave us any feedback with your clear name, that is also fine. I will promise that this does not have any positive or negative consequences for your exam grades. So yeah, if you're feeling brave enough, please still provide us feedback so that we know what you think about this course. That being said, let's get to today's topic. So this topic of food production, and especially trying to make it more resilient and more sustainable, shares obviously some of the motivations that we have for sustainability and resilience in general. So in first few lectures, we talked a lot about those 3 key challenges of the 21st century. Now looking at them particularly through the lens of food production. And when we're using the term food production for the remainder of this lecture, it's not just growing tomatoes or potatoes in the field. It's essentially all types of food. So whether it's husbandry, so something like chickens, pigs, fish, or whatever, or stuff that grows via plants, or if it's going to be insects or whatever. Essentially everything that humans can digest and extract calories from to survive is what we are concerned with when we're talking about food production. And different parts of the food production supply chain, especially the primary production parts, are heavily influenced by some of the, or by the three key challenges that we already talked about earlier in this course. So on one hand, climate change is like one of the major parts here, and food production is like one of the really, really good examples on the need to adapt to a changing climate, but also one of the things, okay, how do we best do that? We looked at those global greenhouse gas emission pathways, depending on how much CO2 or CO2 equivalents or greenhouse gases in general we're going to emit, will have different global warming or different temperatures in terms of global warming. So we already established that the 1.5 degree goal or target is already dead. 2 degrees global warming might be nice, but right now we're heading more towards something like 2.5 to 3 degrees global warming. And doesn't seem to be a lot in terms of absolute units, but as I already discussed, that means way more hot days, longer dry spells, and suddenly very dense and intense rain sessions. So the way that you were used to grow food in the past for the last decade or so is not the same type of agriculture that will reliably work in the future. So either you just calculate with more crop failures, if you're talking about agriculture and plant-based systems, or you have to somehow adapt and manage to circumvent or to adapt to those changing external environmental factors, so that you figure out, okay, how do I handle longer dry spells? What do I do if there's less rain in general? What do I do if something like those 40 degrees that we had 2 weeks ago, 1.5 weeks ago? I think it was a week ago. Yeah, something like that. So those like heat waves where we have 40 degrees plus in Germany, which burn all the crops on the field or some of the crops on the field. Like, how do you handle that? And how do you still manage to get a sufficient amount of calories for the population to not only survive, but maybe have a decent life? So the changing climate, either in terms of just higher annual temperatures on average, or the changing weather patterns, so hotter summers, colder winters, different rain distribution, maybe even less rain, or in some parts of Germany, more rain than usual. How do you handle it? How does it influence your food production system, and how do you adapt food production systems to handle those situations? That's like one of the challenges that we have with food production systems with respect to the three key challenges. Environmental pollution is another serious issue that we're facing. Is the soil contamination map near Goslar, which is color coded, and you can see different types of soil contamination here. Most of the soil contamination comes from the decade-long mining or century-long mining operations that we have here in the Harz region, which cause quite a lot of environmental pollution and soil contamination, and means that there's, for example, now large amounts of lead, cadmium, arsenic, and other heavy metals in the soil. Where our office is here right now in Goslar, there's actually not even a green trash bin, because when you cut your grass or your whatever you grow in your garden, or you cut down your trees, this stuff is considered so contaminated that it cannot go to the green trash bin, which is then composted, but rather has to go in the black trash bin. So this is the level of soil contamination that you have here, which makes agriculture and food production based on plants very, very difficult. No one is going to stop you from growing potatoes in your garden right next door, but it's definitely not healthy and not in a life extending measure. So that's there's a similar problem. And since we already established that we're really bad as human society to manage our waste properly, that there is a tremendous amount of leakage of contaminants into our environment. It means that more and more parts of our environment that we depend on for various reasons getting more and more contaminated. It also means that more and more contaminants are getting into our food systems. We had this example of there being more plastic in the ocean than fish at some point in the future. That is just one facet of this overall problem. And we have the plastic, microplastic, nanoplastics, we have those heavy metals. We have too much fertilizer getting into the environment as part of agricultural processes and so on and so forth. So it gets more difficult if we go back to the first challenge to make agriculture work in general due to climate change. Then we're making it even more difficult for us by shrinking down those places where we can do agricultures by contaminating them. And you also have to somehow live with that or to figure out ways how to adapt to this. I mean, the obvious first part is stop contaminating the environment and stop environmental pollution. But then the second question is, what do I do with those places that are already contaminated? Can I decontaminate them? Or how bad is the contamination? And how do you figure that out? And how do you handle the amount of potential contamination coming into your ecosystem? Maybe, and this is then scaled system, which is also true for climate change, there will be places that are heavily influenced by climate change. Some places, very few places benefit from it, and the rest is somewhere in between. The same is true for environmental pollution. Some places are already unlivable due to environmental pollution. Some are absolutely fine and pristine because they're so far away from our industrial systems that they haven't been touched yet, even though those places barely exist anymore. They found nanoplastic essentially everywhere on this planet by now, and PFAS. And then there are other places in between. They're still somehow livable, but they're also not pristine. And depending on where you are, different measures might be necessary. Let's assume you're in a place that is heavily influenced by climate change. Like, I don't know, let's say Dubai right now is already quite hard to do agriculture. Add 3 degrees global warming to that, and it's definitely absolutely impossible, if it's not already the case, then essentially the only way to do agriculture is indoors, so that you completely shut off the whole food production process from the external environment, because it's just so harmful to the food production process that you cannot deal with anything anymore. The same would be true if the environmental pollution is too high in your area, then you essentially also have to decouple your food production system from the external environment. And of course, if you have both, then climate change and environmental pollution, then same solution there. So that also means that the solution to resilient, sustainable farming, which can adapt to those challenges or mitigate those challenges, or at least like work towards those issues, is also diverse. So there's not one solution, right? You can say, okay, we all have to do indoor farming, or we all have to do permaculture or syntropic farming, or we all have to do X, Y, and that. It very much depends on where you live. This just being now, like, well, this was a specific view on Goslar when it comes to the contamination. This is just the extended view on the whole Harz region. You might wonder why there is so much non-colored parts there. It doesn't mean that it's not contaminated, it just means that no contamination data is available there. They just haven't tested those areas because it's a pretty huge and big area, and they're mostly doing tests where the population lives. So Goslar, Clausthal, and some places nearby, but they're not just sending someone out to probe the whole forest because it's expensive and very time consuming. But we'll get back to that later. And third, this problem of dwindling non-renewable resources also heavily influences our food production systems. On one hand, food production and traditional agriculture heavily relies on fertilizers to boost production. Some of those fertilizers are, for example, guano, which is essentially bird and bat poop, to, to put it simple, which accumulated in certain places of this planet in large amounts and is now mined as a fertilizer. But we're mining those deposits much, much faster than they would be able to regenerate. So it's essentially similar to fossil fuels or fossil energy providers. And another way of getting fertilizer to boost agricultural systems is to use the Haber-Bosch process to create synthetic fertilizer, which then again requires a huge amount of fossil fuels, mostly natural gas, to produce it. So in that respect, we're very much also in the food production system very dependent on non-renewable resources, excluding and ignoring, of course, everything that you need, for example, to run all the heavy machineries, to work on large farms of several hundred hectares, and then all the logistics, which also takes a lot of fuel, and so on and so forth, refrigeration, and so on and so on and so forth. Also, rearing animals is a very resource-intensive process that you have to somehow afford. We're also digging even further into our very slowly regenerating groundwater resources, so that they're pumping water up from deeper and deeper repositories to irrigate the fields. But that only works up to a certain point, because at some point those water repositories are also going to be used and spent. And then what's your next plan to get further water? So we're relying on quite a lot of unsustainable practices just from the resource perspective. Here, we could go even further and discuss the deprecation of soil quality, the topsoil, the fertile topsoil being washed off or blown away by the wind due to unsustainable practices, soil compactation, when the soil gets more compact, and so on and so forth. But this is not supposed to be a how to farm lecture, but more like a lecture on, okay, what type of things we can do with respect to IoT in food production systems. But this was only essentially the main motivation point here. Maybe just some local examples for this non-renewable resource topic, or resource availability in general. We already said that the rain patterns, as well as the amount of rain that falls per year, is changing due to climate change. So it could get, in some places, more rain per year. As other places, it stays stable. In other places, or many places, there's less rain per year. But also the distribution of rain changes heavily, which means that, let's say, initially there was some kind of a stable rain distribution across the year. Now it could mean that we're moving to a very dry summer with no rain for weeks or even months, followed by very wet autumns and winters where we have an excess of water. Problem is, in Germany, you grow food in spring and summer, a little bit in the autumn. So in those periods where you potentially have long dry spells, there's very little food that we exclusively produce in winter. So we're essentially losing the best growing season in Germany to grow plants. Sure, we can grow animals or rear animals and insects all year round, but those also have their limitations to some extent. What I'm trying to say here, water as one important resource in this game is something that is already quite volatile. The image that you can see here is the Oker Dam, the Okertal, the Okertalsperre, that is just between Goslar and Clausthal. And I'm not sure if it was my first or my second year as a professor. I think it was the second year as my professor here, where there was so little water in the Okertalsperre that you could see the old, essentially there were several meters of water missing. It was almost completely dry. You could even see the remains of the old villages, or the old village that they flooded when they constructed the dam at the bottom of the, let's call it lake in parentheses. And more or less 12 months later, in December around Christmas in the following year, there was so much rainfall that they had to do an emergency release of water to protect the dam from bursting. Because there was just so much rain suddenly. So those fluctuations between seasons or moments in time where you have so little water that you essentially have a dry lake, and then suddenly it's overflowing so much just in this 12-month period that you have to get rid of water to protect the infrastructure. It's very, very close by. So this is not something that might happen somewhere. This is actually happening outside here. And this makes it particularly interesting to also do this kind of research somewhere around Goslar at our university, because from those three key challenges, we're already suffering from all of them. We have global warming, which changes the general climate, but also the microclimate around here. We have those dry spells and then suddenly too much rain. We also have heavy contamination levels. So how to adapt to this seems to be a natural research direction to follow here at our university, because we're essentially at the epicenter of the issues that are coming up on the horizon. So that's just the short motivation to better understand, okay, how are food production systems roughly influenced by the three key challenges that we already talked about earlier. Now we'll look into some aspects of resilient and sustainable food production. And afterwards, we'll have a closer look at two actual research systems that we're using for our research here at the university and that we're implementing right now. So they're all little prototyping proof of concept directions, but trying to solve some resilience and sustainability problems in food production with the tools that you learned or that you were introduced to as part of this lecture series. So see it as a very niche case study and example session today. So those are some of the examples from our lab and research environments. So we conduct research on open farm fields. How do we produce in a sustainable and resilient manner food on farm fields? We have then various indoor components. So we have had indoor mushroom tents where we grow mushrooms. We have indoor vertical farming systems. What those are, we'll explain that in a second. We also have so-called indoor aeroponic systems. We'll also explain that in a second. And then we have something in between, like greenhouses, which are not quite indoor because they're still dependent or they're still influenced by the external environment, but they're also not quite outdoor. So in the field, you're totally exposed to the three key challenges, but also to all external environmental factors. Indoors, you can decouple your food production systems completely from all external factors. And then the greenhouse in the middle, it stands out in the sun. So depending on whether the sun shines or not, it gets warmer or colder in the greenhouse, just to provide you one example. So we're essentially covering like all of those different environments with our research setup that we have here. And we'll get to this monitoring thing here later in this presentation. So first, so to give you a little bit of an idea what different farming operations look like, whether it's indoor, outdoor, or in greenhouses, that already gives you a little bit of intuition what type of aspects might be IoT relevant here. So let's start with indoor farming. What you can see here are some types of so-called soil-less systems. So you don't have soil anymore to grow your plants in. Usually those plants then are provided with nutrients via some kind of a nutrition solution. And there are different systems to do that. Sometimes the roots of those plants are just hanging somewhere in the air. Sometimes they are submerged in the nutrition solutions. We'll get to that on the next slide. What you can see here, you can grow different types of plants, from leafy greens to even potatoes. However, this potato part is already, or let's say, is a very niche thing. Usually, and this is already brings us to one of the major downsides of indoor farming or of hydroponic based farming in general, this nutrition solution based farming, is that commercially those systems are mostly used to produce so-called leafy greens. With leafy greens is what I mean is it's almost 0-calorie food. Herbs like basil and thyme, salads, tomatoes, cucumbers, chilies. So everything that essentially grows nicely if it has enough water. Sorry about that, we have to cut that out. But do not really provide calories. Like salad has 0 calories, cucumbers have 0 calories, or more or less 0 calories. You would need to eat quite a lot of salad to get to 2 or 2,500 calories per day. You have to eat several kilos of those. Those grow very, very well in those indoor farming systems. There are some crazy researchers who manage to grow potatoes in such systems, but it's more a proof of concept that it works. Like this is the top of the potatoes, and in those white containers down here is what you can see in the second pictures. So they're essentially just hanging in the air. Those are now like quick overview of some of those systems to grow food in those nutrition solution based systems. The approach is called hydroponics, and you can have different concepts here to do that. So one of the most famous one is the so-called NFT technique. You have a slightly inclined main pot and the base pot with the nutrition solution. On a regular base, you're starting a pump, which then pumps up fresh nutrition solution, which is then used by the plants with their roots. So they're selecting what kind of nutrients they need. It drips back down, and then it's pumped up again in the cycle. The main advantage with this system is you do not waste any water and any nutrients. If you have an open field and you're just irrigating that field by spraying water all over the place, a lot of water just evaporates without ever touching the plant. And it can also just go into the soil and then drip down to the groundwater levels without ever getting near the roots of a system. So those closed circular systems, those hydroponic systems, are very, very efficient to save water and to save nutrients, because what's not used by the plants just goes back into the cycle. However, that already introduces some challenges, and this is where we're getting to the IoT part slowly but surely. On one hand, you need to control different parameters for which you then need sensors. So very, very simple, the timing functions. You need to time or to provide or to activate the pump on a regular basis to provide the upper container with new nutrient solution, which is otherwise just dripping down here, so that the plants and their roots do not dry out. So usually there's something like every 5 to 15 minutes, those pumps have to be activated, pump water up, let it drip down, and then repeat the cycle. So you need something to control that. So you have an actioner, like something actionable that you have to activate, an actuator, the water pump, and you need to measure time. The second thing is, when you're running those systems unsupervised for a longer time, at some point, the plants will have used all the water and or nutrients. So you need something that tells you how much nutrition solution is still there, just in terms of volume. So you need a sensor system that can measure how much water is still in there, or how much nutrition solution is in there. Next sensor tells you what exact nutrient composition is still available there. Because depending on whether you grow, for example, tomatoes or melons or different types of salads, they take out different nutrients from the nutrient solution. So at some point, there might, like, even though you create those nutrient solutions with a certain balance of input components. Depending on what the plants take out, you will end up with some kind of an imbalance. You can think of that maybe as your own fridge. You go to the supermarket, you plan to eat healthy, but still buy 1 or 2 desserts, put all of them in your fridge, and you start eating the desserts, and then there is still some food in your fridge, but it's not the thing that you actually want, or not the stuff that you can survive on. So pretty similar thing. So you need the actuators like the pump, you need the sensor to tell you how much water is there, you need a sensor to tell you whether the nutrition solution composition is still fine. Then you can see that there are also further actuators here, like an air pump and an air stone, because the nutrient solution needs to be refreshed with some air, otherwise it just settles, which is also bad. So you also need to activate this air pump every now and then. There are also other components that we have in our lab that are not visible here. So for example, we also have UV lights in our nutrient solution tank, because otherwise algae just start blooming and growing in there, and then they are eating our nutrients. So you also have to activate the UV light every now and then to prevent that, to keep the tank sterile. So you can already see, okay, there are, just for this very, very simple setup, already different things at work that need to be managed. That at the moment completely ignores the fact whether you need some kind of grow lights in your environment. If you do this in a greenhouse or out in the wild, like so outdoors, you don't have to rely on lights. If you do it in a grow chamber or a grow tent or really in indoor containers, then you also need to provide the light, which needs to be turned on and off every now and then. Then you also have to take care of the air quality, so that there's sufficient air circulation for the plants, because they're consuming CO, they're producing O2. You also have to take care of the air humidity. You can see that there are a lot of things that you need to measure and control in those closed environment systems that you essentially get for free outside. But if your outdoor environment is so fucked up that this doesn't work anymore, you have to go indoors. But then you have to take into account all those different things that you have to measure and to control. So it's quite a technical effort to do all of this, which is essentially yet another downside of indoor farming, that you have to manage everything yourself, what you should get for free outdoors. So back to the different hydroponic approaches. Now we don't have to look at all the different sensors anymore. Now it's really just about some minor differences in how those systems work. So in the NFT system, we had this water pump pumping up the nutrition solution, it dripping down, and every now and then the pump is activated. Deep water cultures work without a pump, so one less component that can fail, where the roots are just sitting directly in the nutrient solution. Sounds easier, and begs the question why to use NFT in the first place. The answer is pretty simple. There are some or most plants don't like to have wet feet all the time. Other plants do very well in those deep water cultures. Wick systems are essentially middle ground between those two. You don't have the roots sitting directly in the nutrient solution at all times. You rather have some wicks that draw up or suck up nutrient solutions into a substrate, which then houses the roots of the plant. You also have so-called ebb flow systems, which are very similar to NFTs. Instead of an inclined, instead of having this angle to make it drip down, you just have a semi-permeable structure where the nutrient solution can drip back down. And then you also have drip systems where you're using the pump to pump the nutrient solution through a hose, which has a small opening at every plant, which then allows nutrient solutions to drip into the substrate next to the plant. And then you can do essentially spot irrigation or spot nutrient supply. But it also means that for every single plant that you're planting, you need to make sure that you properly irrigate every single plant. So if you're thinking about tens of thousands of plants, because you're talking about food production, you have to think about scale. And this becomes a quite cumbersome task, especially if you compare it once again to outdoor farming, where you can grow hundreds of thousands of plants without having to do any of those steps. So, advantage, indoor hydroponic systems, you're completely isolated from the external environment, no matter how fucked up it is. It is very efficient with respect to water recycling and nutrient recycling, but you also have to monitor everything and to handle everything to provide a perfect growth condition that you would otherwise get for free outside if we wouldn't have fucked up our environment. You can do this indoor farming or this indoor hydroponics or hydroponics in general, either indoor or sometimes also outdoor. So what you can see here on the right side is even a step up from just normal hydroponics because it's vertical farming with a hydroponic system. Instead of just having a 2D thing where all of your plants are on the surface, you can start stacking them up vertically and essentially using the third dimension to also grow food. So if you would have 100 square meters as a plain, flat thing, you can only grow, let's say, 100 plants there. But if you start stacking up those 100 meters vertically, you can grow and plant 100 times X the amount of plants on the same area. So this is one of our research towers that we have here. You have a nutrient solution reservoir at the bottom with a pump, which is powered on every 50 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, pumping up nutrient solution to the top, and then it drips down, and on the way down, it provides those plants with nutrients. You can also do the same outdoors. We once had this outdoor test facility to grow some of those things, but it was quite cumbersome to maintain it, but it still worked great. And this on the left is our farm robot in our greenhouse. We'll get back to it later. I just want to say that you can do this hydroponics indoor or outdoor, but primarily used nowadays in the indoor setup. When you're now thinking to extend the sustainability, the circularity aspect, because we're already recycling quite a lot of water, we're recycling all the nutrients that haven't been used in the previous cycle by the plants, you can then go further and think about, okay, how can I get even more circularity in there in such an environment that I completely control with my IoT setup? One way to do that, besides recycling the water until there's no water left anymore, everything is consumed by the plants, is to think about where does this nutrition solution even come from? Because in essence, this nutrient solution is just liquid fertilizer that you can buy at the hardware store or online. So it has the same downsides as the synthetic fertilizer that is produced for traditional agriculture. So it usually comes from some kind of a fossil and non-renewable or almost non-renewable source. So we're better in terms of using it more efficiently, but we're still dependent on a fossil input somehow. So are there ways to replace it with a more sustainable, more circular fertilizer replacement? And yes, there are some ideas to do that. One is called aquaponics, where you are raising fish in closed systems and fish poop into their water tanks. If you don't filter that water, the fish will die. So one idea, because fish poop has certain similarities with bird or bat poop, as we discussed for the guano as one of the non-renewable fertilizer sources. So you can use it more or less in the same way. So some people thought about, okay, what happens if I combine hydroponics and fish rearing? What if I use the poop water of the fish to feed the plants and get then essentially filtered water back? And that pretty much works. You can do that. You have to put it through some kind of a small mechanic filter to get out the worst stuff from the fish tank, provide it to the plants. They take out certain types of nutrients, and then you can filter the water back and then create some kind of closed loop. So you're circulating water and nutrients through both tanks, which you then can use to grow the plants and the fish, and in the end you get both. You get calories from plants and calories from fish. The limitation there is that it once again only works for low calorie food, but it essentially works. You can also get alternative fertilizers potentially from byproducts of other industries. So in the production process of alcohol, there is something called melasse, which is essentially an unused byproduct, which can be used as a fertilizer and is biodegradable. You can also use certain processes that are or certain byproducts that are created in composting biomass, then also some kind of a water drips down, which you can collect and then use as a fertilizer. So you can continue using the circular logic to further decrease the amount of unsustainable inputs that you need for those systems. You can push it even one step further, and this is what we did with one of our research partners. Because when you think about growing plants as one of your food providers, usually you do not use the whole plant. Let's say you have potatoes. You use the potatoes underground and the green stuff on top. Usually you throw away. At best case, you compost it. If you're growing tomatoes, you're eating the red fruits, throw away the rest. And that is pretty much true for a lot of parts of the plant. So what if you can feed those leftovers, for example, to insects? They love that stuff. Then you can use the insects to feed the fish, which poop in the water, which then provides the plants again with some fertilizers to grow. You produce new leafy stuff from the plants, you can feed it to insects and so on and so on. Of course, this is not a perfectly closed loop and you would need to balance that out. So this is like a very complex system, but the logic in itself works. So how do I reduce a lot of external inputs that way? And when we worked with those, the people are called Farm Insect, and when we worked with them on different research projects, we also got to visit them. We saw their production. We helped them with some sensor setups and some digitalization processes. But what you can just see from the pictures without understanding how the rearing of black soldier flies and black soldier fly larvae and insects in general work, you can see there's a lot of technology involved. They have automated feed composition and feeding machines. They have growth chambers. They have sorting machines. They have a rearing station here where the larvae are being produced. All of them, once again, closed environments, completely shut off from the external environment. So once again, a huge amount of sensors needed to first understand the current state of the environment, and then a large amount of actuators used to control and manipulate the environment. Also including all the different communication channels between the sensors and the main communication hub, the actuators and the main communication hub, and also a lot of data processing in between to make sense of the data and then make the appropriate decision what to do next. So those are real world examples of very high complex IoT systems for food production. So it's true for the greenhouses, it's true for the hydroponic systems, it's true for those insects. And those are just like being very simple examples here. If you push this idea to the extreme of saying, okay, I want to keep everything somehow circular, I want to at best get all the resources somehow nearby, you could think about something like those food production units where you have large modular scalable container systems that you can put in places where the external environment is so adverse to growing or to traditional agriculture that you cannot grow anything outdoor anymore, that you're essentially using old production facilities or such modular container systems that you can just plug together, and you try to collect the energy from solar panels on the roof. You also use those solar panels on the roof to collect all the water that you can get potentially, and inside you have different stages of food production, potentially the aquaponics, potentially the hydroponics, or the insect rearing, and what else you can think of, and you're trying to balance those out in such a way that you're relying on as little external inputs as possible. That is a very futuristic concept, but it serves as an inspiration where to go to, first of all, learn to adapt to climate change, handle the already contaminated environment, and use as little external inputs as possible to produce as many calories as possible. Next, one example that we concluded or that we performed as a research project in our research groups 2 or 3 years back, where we had a lot of friends because we produced a lot of gourmet mushrooms. So high-end mushrooms that usually cost you quite a lot of money at the supermarket. And we were tasked to build a growth chamber, an automatically controlled growth chamber for those gourmet mushrooms. What's the difference between a normal mushroom and a gourmet mushroom? First of all, they taste much better and they're more expensive, but also they are more difficult to grow. And this is one of the reasons why they are more expensive. If you're thinking about white or brown button mushrooms, or also called champignons, they are super simple to grow. They have a flat bed with some substrate, and then they grow, and you can look at them from the top with a camera. And once the champignon has a certain diameter, you know that you can just run a blade at the bottom to cut them and you're done. Unfortunately, gourmet mushrooms like oyster mushrooms are way more picky with respect to their environment, and they're also not growing in regular shapes. We'll see that in a second. And they're also not quite as predictable in their growth process as you may like. This is, by the way, also the example that you have seen in the LCA lectures with Anand, where he explained to you this reusable mushroom pot thing. Just a different perspective on the whole experiment. So we constructed a growth chamber. We equipped it with tons of sensors and controllers and actuators to provide the perfect growth environment. So mushrooms like it warm and moist. So you always have to make sure that there is enough moisture and that it's warm enough. And you also have to maintain the air quality, and you somehow have to get everything in balance, because the more air you pump out, the more of the moist air gets out. So then you have to put new moist air in, and you need to balance it. You need proper temperature. You need a little bit of light for most of gourmet mushrooms to grow, but not too much. Otherwise, it also doesn't work properly. So it's a very sensitive growth environment. It works somehow out in some forests, but if you want to do it commercially, you need to recreate those perfect growth conditions for your food. So we set up all of that. We created a digital twin for each of those growth chambers and for each of our mushrooms pots, so that we had a digital representation of each of them. We added a lot of camera equipment to monitor the growth of the mushrooms. We trained an AI system to detect properly when is each mushroom ready for harvesting. And then we also created a semi-automatic mushroom harvesting tool. And that looked a little bit like this. So we had a growth chamber with mushroom pots stacked inside, and the AI system analyzing pretty much the current growth stage of each of those mushrooms. So we had different growth levels. This is the first number here, so 3, 2, I think we had 1 and 4 as well. They indicated in what harvesting stage they were. If I'm not mistaken, 3 meant overripe and 2 was perfect for harvest. 1 meant not ready for harvest. And then it also gives you a percentage of how sure the AI is that it detected the growth stage correctly. So depending on how well the camera got the angle, the better the prediction quality essentially. And you can also use that to control when certain food is ready to be harvested, which is also very important in indoor farming system or food production systems in general. Because in best case, you have a steady supply throughout the year or over a longer time span, instead of having 100 tons of mushrooms all ready at one day. If you can stretch it out by controlling the growth environment in such a way that you can extend the growth period, perfect. So for example, if you cool down the mushroom cans, they stop growing and stop maturing, or at least the process gets slower. So if you know, okay, no one will grab my mushrooms on Sunday because all the stores are closed, and I know my customer comes on Monday, then I can try to use my growth environment that I control. I can try to manipulate it in such a way that they're ready to be harvested on Monday. But once again, that needs a complex IoT setup. I need to know what is the current state of the growth environment. This needs to be communicated to my processing unit via some kind of wireless means. In our case, it was pretty simple Wi-Fi because those are in our lab. Then you have to process that information to make sense. Okay, it's 15 degrees now. If I want it to be ready by Monday, based on past sensor data and machine learning or AI tools, I know that they grow at this rate under those conditions. So let's turn the temperature down to 12 degrees via the actuators that we have, and then still collect the data to learn if it works to improve our AI learning algorithm for the next time and see if the mushroom is really ready to be harvested by Monday instead of Sunday. Or is it already overripe on Monday? So it's a complex feedback loop that works pretty well on this IoT overview that we had so far. Another very niche building block here, just to give you an intuition for the complexity of this topic, to get to those super autonomous food production units where you just throw some inputs in on one side and then food falls out on the other side and everything else is perfectly controlled and automatically working and so on and so forth, blah, blah, blah. Let's look at one other very particular part here that also is essentially part of the IoT, and that we're researching here in our lab just in the room behind this wall. So in 2021, 2023, something like that, some Israeli scientists published a paper where they listened to tomato plants with ultrasound microphones. And it turns out that those tomatoes cry and make ultrasounds when they're under stress. The stress that they induced were on one hand water stress, so not watering the plants enough so that they're essentially drying out. And the second stress that was particularly interesting is when they cut the tomato plants, they also gave out ultrasounds, which is freaky enough in itself that this actually works and they could reproduce this. But it also has quite some really interesting applications with respect to managing indoor and outdoor farming systems very, very efficiently. Let's just think about the water stress example. How do you know whether a plant needs to be watered? If you're looking at the leaves and they're already brown or they're hanging down, then there's already some damage being done to the plant. So essentially you're too late. The alternative is to water the plant before those symptoms happen. But then there's the risk of overwatering the plants. Most plants are okay if you do not overdo it. Some plants are very sensitive to that. But with respect to resource efficiency, you theoretically would like to water the plant as little as possible, but as much as necessary. So how do you figure that out? Those ultrasounds are actually an interesting point to do that, because once those plants emit sounds that they need water, that they're in water stress or underwater stress, you can water them. Those stress symptoms appear much, much earlier than the dry leaves, and the damage to the leaf or to the plants hasn't been done yet. So it allows you to act much quicker and not overwater those plants if you can filter out those ultrasounds that give you an idea of how the plant is feeling. You could even push it a little bit further, because we're not absolutely in the business of just making the plant happy from the perspective of food production system, especially sustainable and resilient food production systems. We are primarily interested in how do we get the most out of a food production system while putting the least amount of resources in. So is there some kind of an intersection or some kind of a crossover between plant suffering and maximum output? How much suffering can the plant take before the output, the harvest, declines too much? Is there a certain level of stress, of torturing of plants that is ethically, morally, but also from the plant physiology acceptable before we cannot properly harvest anything anymore? So even without the torturing part, we're getting notified via a biological sensor and then the physical ultrasound sensor earlier than we would be able to see the need for water via cameras on the plant, which allows us to use our water that we have more wisely. That said, this is a super complicated setup and super complex. We're trying to make it more simple so that it works much easier. At the moment, it's super complicated, but it's an interesting research direction to go. It becomes even more interesting if you think about extending the types of information that you can get from the plant. So the Israelis started with water stress and cutting the plants. That is established, it works for a certain amount of plants like tomatoes and basil. Next question is this a general behavior of all plants? Can we measure it at an arbitrary level of plants? Or are there certain types of plants, shrubs, trees, leafy greens, vegetables, fruit trees, that exhibit this behavior more pronounced than others? Because then you know which plants you can best manage with such a system. Then there's the question, can we identify further stressors? So not just cutting and water stress. Going back to our Goslar example, maybe there is a way to identify soil contamination or environmental contamination. Do they also produce those sounds if there is soil contamination? And if so, can we differentiate different types of soil contamination? Does the cry for lead contamination sound the same as when there's arsenic in the ground? Do they give out those type of sounds when the temperature is too high, too low, when there's too much sunlight or too little sunlight? Can we essentially skip this whole part of looking at a plant, seeing it looks like shit, and then trying to do something about it by getting all those stressors up first and thereby using our resources the most likely? So if I have to use grow lights in an indoor system, what's the least amount of grow light time that I can get away with? If we're thinking about soil contamination, it's very expensive to do lab tests for all of your places, because just because this square meter where I'm standing right now is not contaminated doesn't mean that the square meter where Anand's place is 5 meters across from me is also not contaminated. Like, you don't know, you would need to essentially test each and every square meter if it's contaminated or not. But if you can just listen to the plants and they are telling you, yep, this is contaminated or not, you're saving a lot of money, but also making it much easier to do food production. So this is why I brought this very tiny niche example here, also from the IoT sector. And it once again follows our IoT example pipeline that we had. We deploy sensors. We have some ultrasound microphones that we place next to the plants. We also have some ultrasound measurements to hardware that is directly attached to the plant for better reading. They are communicating those information via a communication channel. I think here it's actually wired. Then we're sending those information from the wired via the wired cable to a processing unit. Then we have to do quite some complex machine learning on top. Then we can use it to derive certain actions from it and communicate that back to the growth environment that controls our plants to do certain actions like water the plants, for example, or turn on the light. While we're talking about listening to plants and monitoring the environment, there's also other aspects that influence the food production, especially of plants, quite heavily. And that is essentially the insects around them, or in general, the biodiversity around them. So biodiversity means essentially all the other living things in an ecosystem. That could be, to simplify it now, are there insects available for pollination? But also, is it just a monoculture of plants, so millions of tomatoes on a field? Or is there a certain level of biodiversity which helps to keep pests away and so on and so forth? So biodiversity also is a quite important part in food production. Without going into all the details now, that would be a whole lecture in itself. But how do you measure biodiversity? Well, the cheapest and most established way to do that is you take students, you put them in a field, and let them write down whatever they see 24/7. However, some students might not like to be in a forest at 4 a.m. at night. And also, it's really hard to completely monitor your whole environment while you're being out in the wild, just because you might not see everything that happens. Like, how do you count, for example, bees or insects or super small animals if you don't even see them, or if they're hiding in the underbrush? Then you also have the problem that just your presence in the forest potentially changes the behavior of some of the things that you want to monitor. I mean, the trees are not going to run away, but if you're trampling down up and down a path, you might scare the hedgehog away or the mice or whatever. Therefore, you don't see a mice anymore, and you conclude there are no mice. That's not true, because they might have been there once you were gone. So you get the idea. So how do I properly monitor this? And keep in mind that this has pretty much the same issue as a soil contamination analysis. In order to determine the biodiversity of a larger area, you need a lot of measuring points, because just because I couldn't find the mice here doesn't mean that there is no mice where Anant is sitting. And the same is true for insects, population, bees, and so on and so forth. So you also need to come up with sensor systems that you can place and scale very nicely to cover larger areas, but also then reliably detect the presence or the absence of certain species. So we've been involved in one insect project where we had a video feed system where we had this plate. This is actually like a metal plate here, and those are fake flowers being painted on this metal plate, and then there was a camera looking down at this metal plate. It was placed somewhere in the forest or in the field, and then insects were sitting down. The camera caught them and then analyzed, okay, this is bee species X, Y, Z, and the more of those you see per time unit, the higher probably the population. We also followed the audio route further. We had several of those so-called audio moss sensors placed in different areas. We put them in the nature reserve, we put them in the gardening area, and listened for bats at night and for insects throughout the day. The more insects you can hear, the higher the rate of pollination. You could not really differentiate all the insects just by their sound, but you can at least determine if some of them are there or not. If you put that sensor in a supermarket parking lot, there's probably not many insects nearby. If you put it in a nature reserve, you heard humming more or less all the time during the day. And at night, we listened to the bats. Bats hunt insects, so there's also a correlation between the occurrence of bats and insects and vice versa. We also put them in honeycombs, or in not honeycombs, but essentially in those boxes where honeybees live, and use them to learn more about the behavior and the health status of bee colony. So this is essentially down here, the inner parts of a beehive is the word I was looking for. Of a beehive, we placed the sensors here and then monitored manually the well-being of the bees to then also correlate the findings or the information sensed by our audio sensors with the real behavior of the bees. That's serving as yet another example for you to think about in terms of sensors. When you have a temperature sensor, you know it works correctly because the manufacturer promised you it would do. Then there's not really a question what the temperature sensor measures. It measures the temperature. And you know if it gives you a 30, it means there's 30 degrees Celsius in there. This is when you already know what your data means. So it's not just a 0 or a 1. You already know the meaning behind the data. This is a really good example here of you first having to learn what that means, because we could identify different sound categories and sound levels inside the beehive. But what does that mean? Does it mean they are healthy? Does it mean they're increasing their population or decreasing, or some predators made it into the beehive? What does it mean? So you have to manually check to learn and understand what certain sensor data means. And since I'm running a little bit out of time, we're going to skip this part. This is essentially about the complexity of biodiversity. So it's not just listening for certain species to make a statement about biodiversity. It's also not just about having measurements from certain places via certain sensors, but that you need a very, very complex system to make proper statements there. Now, back to two of our case studies from our research lab with a very particular IoT focus. One of those is called Farm Insight. It is a self-developed monitoring platform, which essentially fulfills all the nice parts of this bigger application that we, or this bigger picture that we presented here. We have a large variety of sensors in this system. We have also actuators. So we have temperature sensors, humidity sensors, soil moisture sensors, water sensors, wind direction sensors, and so on. So we have like, I think, 20 or 30 different types of sensors here. There's also different actuators. You turn on lights, turn off lights, activate pumps, move a robot. So we have that. We also have different communication protocols for the sensors among each other, but also for communication with certain computational units in our decentralized computation network. Then we have an IoT platform which aggregates our collected data, and then also for some actions uses AI to make certain prediction and then handle that information. So we also have this analytics part in here. So that's why we're having a quick look at what Farm Insight does and can do. The initial main idea was to use Farm Insight or develop a tool that can handle and control the robot that you can see here in our greenhouse in Goslar. So this robot stands on those legs here and can move essentially in 3 dimensions over this raised bed here. So it can move left, right, it can move forward and backwards, but it can also work on the Z-axis, so it can move this small head over here up and down to do certain tasks like plant seeds, water plants, get rid of weeds. And also it has a camera to monitor everything. It can water the bed. We can also tell it to just water here and there, but we wanted to have a monitoring platform for that so that we know when to do what. Later, it also evolved a little bit further to also control our other grow systems like the vertical farming hydroponic tower or our mushroom tent or our aeroponic systems in the room just behind me. In one sentence, the difference between aeroponics and hydroponics, instead of having the nutrition solution float by the roots, a small valve is essentially spraying the nutrition solution at the roots. So it's not really immersed in the nutrition solution, it's just sprayed, slightly more efficient than hydroponic systems, but otherwise same approach, no soil, just nutrition solution regularly applied. This is also where we are torturing the tomatoes. So this is where we do this ultrasound experiment. But all of those systems, the day-to-day business by those systems, are controlled via Farm Insight. And Farm Insight essentially notifies our employees if something goes wrong, like if we're running out of nutrition solution, if lights are broken, if sensors are not recording back. It gives us information and lets us know that we need to act. We'll have a quick look at a demo in a second, but this is what a view on Farm Insight could look like, where all those information are then later aggregated into a dashboard so that users can consume all the information that we have gathered, made sense of, analyzed, and also the actions taking place here. So this is a screenshot from our greenhouse. You can see we also have cameras in there. We actually have two, but I think one is currently under maintenance so that we can monitor the whole raised bed. Like we can see what's going on there without being present in the greenhouse. We have the different temperatures here. We can see what has been planted in this raised bed so that we know, okay, what happened here. We can see how much was harvested. So you get an idea, okay, it's essentially a nice user dashboard to get everything that you need, but we'll have the quick demo in a second. What does this look like under the hood? So you have a simple client, your browser using React and React and something to just make this visually nice representation of everything. Then we have our own cluster, which runs the backend of this Farm Insight dashboard, where we have just normal SQLite databases, but also a specific database just for time series data, which is pretty much the essence of sensor data coming in. So lesson learned for you from that perspective. If I'm handling a lot of IoT sensor data, which are then time series data very often, there are specialized databases just for this use case. So of course you can also put all of this normally in, for example, a SQL database or SQLite or MySQL or Postgres database, but there are also specific databases just for time series data, which can make sense for the specific data storage handling of IoT data. We also store our camera pictures and the videos that we take on this cluster. They are neither in the SQLite nor in the InfluxDB because in both cases, those camera images do not really make sense. And each of our so-called food production facilities, or in short, FPFs, communicates separately and runs autonomously from our backend. What is an FPF? Our greenhouse is one food production facility. Our vertical farming tower is a food production facility. Our mushroom tent is a food production facility. Our aeroponic system is one, but also our outdoor research field that we're doing agriculture outdoor is a food production facility. Each of them have a separate node which controls all the sensors and actuators controlled by it, but we'll get to that in a second. So but just for you, the logic: client talks to backend, backend has different data storage, food production facilities have one specific compute node attached for all of them. We also later added a separate AI backend because we started to make AI predictions with Farm Insight, but we'll get to that in a second. This outlines a little bit more detail what the FPFs might look like. So this here is essentially what you have just seen as backend and frontend for the dashboard. And then they have different FPFs here. And the FPFs have a Python Django backend in itself, which runs and communicates with the main backend of Farm Insight. But those FPF backends are also able to run separately on their own if they lose connection to the main backend, because our cluster might be down or the FPFs might lose their internet connection, so that they still can collect data. And once connection has been reestablished, they send all the data to the main server. This is also necessary not just because we want to collect data, but also if they lose, if the whole server would control every action on our FPFs, then it would mean once they lose connection, suddenly we wouldn't water the plants anymore. We wouldn't control the light anymore. We wouldn't control the heat, the soil moisture, the air humidity, or anything anymore. Everything would break. Therefore, we decided to put those FPF backends on Raspberry Pis right at the place where the actual action is happening, so that it's always sure that, or more or less ensured, that everything is running properly. So this is also why these FPFs have a backup database where they store data until they can deliver it. And from there, the FPF backend is in charge of the specific connections to each of the sensors. To some sensors, it's connected with a wire. To some sensors, it talks via Wi-Fi. To other sensors, it talks via Zigbee or LoRaWAN or whatever makes sense, or MQTT. It depends on the sensors, what the sensors can do, and what makes most sense for us. So the physical network connection type, the protocol, as well as the actual protocol being used over that physical channel, differs and is totally dependent on the sensors. So if you're interested, you can have a look at Farm Insight yourself. I hope that the cluster now doesn't die and Anand has to restart it, because usually we use it for internal research and not to have 20 visitors at the same time. I'm going to briefly share my screen for a live demo, and I guess you're able to see it now. Your view when you go to that website might look slightly different than my view because I have admin rights. So what you can see here is that we have those different food production facilities. Some of them are under maintenance. Some have cameras, some don't. So this is our farm bot in the greenhouse with the camera, which gives you the image from 1 p.m. or 1:25 p.m. where we took the last image, what's happening in the greenhouse right now. You can also get the different temperature values, for example, from different sensors, like what's the temperature inside the greenhouse over a certain amount of time, what's the humidity level. The greenhouse is powered by a solar panel with a battery, so we have to also monitor how much energy are we drawing, how much energy are we generating with the solar panels, because if the battery runs out of power, the whole greenhouse shuts down until we have regained enough battery. And that sounds a little bit annoying, but it's one of the things that we actually want to practice and to research. How can we grow as much calories as possible while putting the least amount of resources in? So in best case, the greenhouse runs completely independent. It generates its own power by our solar panels. It collects rainwater from the roof, which is stored in a tank. And we combined that, and now the AI prediction part is also getting in there, because thus far it's essentially gathering information like sensor data and then making decision on what is the status right now. The plants are thirsty and we have water in the tank, so the system automatically starts watering the plants. But do we know if there is still or essentially for how long do we will have sufficient amount of waters? When do we start or need to start rationing the water? Because there's a long heat period coming with no rain. This is why Farm Insight also looks into the weather forecast that we get from an API. So you can see today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow here, but the system actually grabs more information ahead of time. I think 7 or 14 days. Yeah, 7 days seems to be the prediction here. And then it starts making predictions. This first graph here is making predictions based on the weather forecast of rain. So the system knows how much rain is in our water. Rainwater is in our water tank right now. And it looks into the weather forecast, which tells, at your specific location, we expect 15 liters of rain per square meter over the next 7 days. The system knows how big the roof is. So let's say 4 square meter times 15 liters, theoretically 60 liters. It also learned that if the weather forecast predicts 15 liters per square meter, due to its special location, it only gets 10 liters per square meter. So instead of 60, it calculates with 40 liters. And then there are different scenarios on how the water tank level could develop depending on how accurate the weather predictions are. So in worst case, we're going from 140 liters to just 110 liters in a few, or to, no, sorry, 80 liters in a few days. Best case, we end up with 191 liter if it rains more than expected and you need to water less. So you can see this whole logic that we discussed in the previous IoT lectures here, from sensing data, communicating the data, analyzing that data on these different analysis levels. So from just understanding what is now to making predictions for the future, and then cycling those back into the actuators to do some practical actions there. Because if we know we're running out of water, we're trying to water as little as possible without killing the plants. If we know there's plenty of water, then we're more generous. The same is true for all other types of resources, meaning, for example, energy. If the batteries are low because of cloudy weather and low solar panel production, we're trying to reduce our power consumption by turning off the cameras and then step by step the least relevant systems. The same should be true for all other inputs into such a system. We also have our outdoor field that doesn't have a camera, but similarly the different types of information, different weather forecasts. So you get the idea what's happening there. So that was a look in Farm Insight, or farm management and monitoring platform for food production facilities, or FPFs in short, that give a nice overview, or not an overview, but a more nice intuition on a practical example for those different building blocks of the Internet of Things processing pipeline that we discussed multiple times in this lecture. Now, we're going to have a quick look at a different topic that is also related to food production, using data that has been gathered and then using AI or machine learning to feed into an IoT-powered system, I would say. With Farm Insight, we monitored existing food production systems for plants. You could theoretically also adapt Farm Insight to be used for aquaponics or for insect rearing or for chickens or anything else, because Farm Insight doesn't care if it's monitoring the temperature of a greenhouse or a chicken coop, or the water quality of a hydroponic system versus the fish tank, but it's mostly used for plants. But the important point is something has already been planted. Farm Insight monitors the well-being and the growth of environment of something that has already been planted, and tries to do that as resource efficient as possible, so that we put the least amount of information resources in there while getting the most amount of calories out there. But it ignores, or it does not cover, the very important question: what should I plant in the first place to get the most calories out, given my circumstances? Because what I can plant and what produces calories very much depends on what growth environment I can recreate, or if I'm talking about outdoor farming, on where I live. So what I plant in Dubai looks very different to what I plant in Goslar to produce as many calories as possible, just to give an example. And this is essentially where farm plant comes into place. And for that, we have an actual outdoor research field from the NEOX project, which we can use to and collaborate with. And they have these, or had this very, like they still have it, but now it looks different. They have this very large open field of roughly 1,500 square meters that can be used. And I'll give you the task to select and plant plants to get the most calories out of this 1,500 square meters. What would you do? How do you best approach this? In order to properly do that, you first need a lot of information to make that decision. On one hand, where is this place? Is it in Dubai? Is it by coincidence near Magdeburg? Is it in Spain? Because that dictates the climate. So gather information first by our sensors or other places. Luckily, for most places on this planet, there are already historic weather reports that you can easily access via APIs or different means. So in order to decide what plants am I going to go to plant there, you need to know what are the temperatures there over the period of time, usually over a year, or in best case, you can even go back over 10 years so that you know, okay, we have temperatures ranging between -1 and 3 on average. We had 60 liters of rainfall per square meter in January over those past 10 years, 103 liters of rainfall in July, and so on and so forth, assuming that those information are correct. That gives you already something to work with. So then you know, okay, I need plants that survive those temperatures and that can live with a certain amount of rain. Do I have to expect a dry period in summer or not? So you have to already select plants according to that. Only then you can try to start selecting those plants that produce the most calories and fulfill certain other criteria that might be important. Besides the general temperature trends, another super important information, and I'm just giving out random examples now that are relevant to make those decisions, are so-called hardiness zones. The hardiness zone essentially tells you what is the expected minimum temperature, not the expected average minimum temperature, but like what's the coldest day per year to be expected in a certain place. And for example, hardiness zone 5b means that in winter, you expect the lowest temperature to be -26 and -23 degrees Celsius. So you need plants that can survive if they're like perennials so that they stay multiple years like trees. You need a plant that can survive that. If it's just like annual crops like corn or tomatoes, you don't have to worry about those. But if you're talking about trees, shrubs, and other things, then you need to know, okay, what can survive where I'm living? So Clausthal here has hardness zone 8b, if I'm not mistaken. The color should match, so we're expecting something like -10 if there isn't a color missing. Could work. I don't know. We have to check. I don't think that this works quite well, but you get the idea because I think it has been colder than -10 in Clausthal this summer or this winter. Anyway, besides information that someone else gathered for you, you can of course also try to put extra information gathering sensors there yourself. So what you can see here is we placed soil temperature sensors, soil moisture and soil temperature sensors. There we also put a weather station there to grab live data from this specific location so that we can learn more about this information. You can also take soil samples to understand, is this a very loamy soil or a very sandy soil? Is it rich in nutrients? All of that helps you to make a decision, okay, what should I plant? What grows well here? And we did all of this. Those sensors for you, since you're in an IoT course here, those are sensors that are connected via LoRaWAN. Those are here the antennas. So LoRaWAN covers quite some distances. We discussed that because in C, we're out on a field here. There is no Wi-Fi reception. So the only options that we had was either 4G, 5G, or those LoRaWAN sensors. We decided to go via LoRaWAN because it's the cheapest option. So we just send it to the nearest building, which has a LoRaWAN receiver or the gateway. And then from there, we go via normal internet connection of the nearby buildings. But it covers quite some distance there. Then, after you have gathered all of those information from various data sources, being it APIs as virtual sensors or actual sensors that you have on the ground, you can think about, okay, how do I best put all those different plants together so that I get the maximum amount of calories out? So of course you can just say, okay, I plant one plant there in a two-dimensional grid, and then I try to get as many plants there that produce as much calories as possible there. So I cover everything, for example, with potatoes. Then all the ground is covered. What you can, of course, also try to do, being inspired by the vertical farming idea, is to think in different layers. Because you can plant, for example, very high trees and plant something else below it. Because you only have the stem and like you have a very large canopy that covers a certain area, and you have trunk below that, but there can still be a lot of other stuff like shrubs, smaller trees, or your potatoes growing below that. Those separations here are called stratas. That is a relevant term because you will get to that in a second for your homework. So here you can see, for simplification reasons, 4 so-called stratas. You have the emergent plants or trees, which are the blue ones. You have the high trees or plants, the green one. You have the medium ones, are the yellow ones. You have the low ones that grow in the shadow here. And then you have the ground covers. For your homework, I think ground was replaced with shrubs, if I'm not mistaken, but we'll get to that in a second. So the question is, how can I combine as many of those plants so that they don't interfere with each other, but still produce the most amount of calories? So instead of just two-dimensional planning, we're doing three-dimensional planning for getting the most calories there. And for our cooperation with this project with the New York's people, we decided to do a combination of so-called tree lines and fields in between. We decided to go with 6 tree lines, 2, 4, 5, 6, which go north, south, and everything in between those tree lines is then going to be crop and vegetable fields. So all of those black lines are the 6 tree lines, and tried with them to put as many trees and plants in those tree lines so that they produce the most amount of calories. And there is no tool to do that. There is also almost no existing research on how to do it, because most research focuses on how do I make the most money out of a given square meter. Thus far, no one thinks about it in any deeper meaning or with any deeper concerns about, given the fact that climate change, environmental pollution, and dwindling resources are challenging us, how do I get the most food, the most calories out of any given square meter that we still have, while putting the least amount of inputs in there and without least compromising the soil and so on and so forth? That leads too far. But essentially the main question, how do I get the most calories out of a given area, is something that has rarely been researched and properly understood. So therefore, there is no tool support. Therefore, there is not really any research on this where you can just go and see, okay, this is a step-by-step process that I have to do that. So at the moment, the state of the art on how to do this is get out your Excel spreadsheet and do it as good as you can manually with a lot of knowledge, a lot of trial and error, and a lot of brain power, and then come up with a planting schedule. So this is just an excerpt from one of those planting schedules. So for tree lines 5 and 6, unfortunately, those are the German names, and there's a lot of other additional information in there that is not relevant for you, but it gives you an idea. That cannot be it. As a computer scientist, I tell you, this can't be it. There must be a smarter and better way to do that. And that is essentially not exercise 6, but exercise 8. You have the goal, and you will find all the information as usual on Clausthal. You have, as an exercise task, the goal to plan the planting schedule or the planting map for 6 of the tree rows there. 3 of those tree rows are 25 meters by 1.5 meters. The other three tree rows are 25 by 1 meter. So you have essentially this space here as an example. How do you plant the most plants and trees here to get the most calories out of this patch, of this tree row, while using this combination of vertical stacking and further information that we provide to you on CoCalc. So on CoCalc, you will find an extensive explanation of the task and what you should or are supposed to consider. You will also find a CSV file with information on certain plants that you can use, like how big is a walnut tree going to be, to what strata does a walnut tree belong, how many calories does a walnut tree produce per year, and so on and so forth. So you don't have to find out those things yourself, but you have to come up with a smart algorithm to use all this externally sourced information to then generate something new out of this. So we have virtual sensors, like what are the weather information. We have gathered information from our actual data sources or data sensors. And now you're supposed to create knowledge and actionable items out of the collected data from an IoT system. We have done that ourselves. So we have a rough idea what the result should look like, but we're also curious if you can beat the configuration that we came up with in terms of calorie production. So let's say 7 million would be an excellent number. If someone gets to 8 or 9 million, we're talking business here. 8 or 9 million calories per year from those 6 tree lines. That gets us to the end of this lecture. Maybe the last note on the exercises. Some of those or a lot of this data has been simplified for the purpose of your exercise. Do not use it to invest 6 figures of your own money to start a farm based on that data. Please consult us before you do this, then we can give you the more complex and real data. Some of this has been simplified for the sake of making this homework compatible or exercise compatible. Just maybe that as a last warning information before you invest all your money in an imaginary farm with fake data or partially fake data. That's it. Thank you very much. We'll meet again at 4 p.m. for the Q&A session. So grab a coffee, relax a little bit, take a deep breath, and thank you all for watching. See you in the next lecture.